Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we're venturing into the darkest corners of America's wilderness, places where the trail ends, the road bends, and the night swallows every sound. I'll be sharing a collection of true encounters and chilling legends from remote mountains, shadowed forests, and lonely backroads across the country. These aren't campfire myths. These are real experiences that linger long after the sun goes down. So grab a blanket, kill the lights, and settle in for a journey where beauty meets terror. Don't forget to subscribe, drop a like, and share your own eerie stories in the comments. Now, let's begin. Story 1. The Lanterns on Pine Hollow Road. I was 16 that summer, restless and bored in the kind of way only a small Appalachian town can make you. My cousin Aaron was older by 2 years and braver by 10. We'd spent the day hauling brush behind my uncle's property. And by the time the sun went down, the air had that damp, heavy feeling that makes the world seem smaller, like the forest is leaning in to listen. We were walking back along Pine Hollow Road, a narrow stretch of cracked pavement that twisted between thick walls of pine, when we saw them. 3 pale lanterns swaying in the dark, just ahead where the road curved. At first, we thought it was folks from town, maybe setting up for a night hunt or one of those late-night berry-picking trips the old-timers sometimes did. But the longer we watched, the more wrong it felt. The lanterns didn't bob like someone walking. They swayed slowly, in perfect rhythm, like pendulums. There was no chatter, no crunch of boots on gravel, no wind to move them. Even the crickets had gone silent. Aaron muttered that we should go see, but something in my gut told me we shouldn't. It wasn't fear exactly, more like my body knew something my mind didn't. Still, he started walking toward them, and I followed because that's what I always did. The closer we got, the clearer the shapes became. 3 figures holding the lanterns, their arms stiff, their heads bowed. They didn't turn or even flinch at our approach. The light from their lanterns was strange, too white, like winter moonlight caught in glass. My mouth was dry, and I kept thinking I couldn't hear them breathing. They stepped off the road into the trees without hesitation, their movements perfectly in sync. Aaron glanced back at me with that grin he always had before doing something stupid, then followed them in. I stopped at the tree line. The air was colder there, heavy in my lungs, and the forest smelled like damp stone instead of pine. I called after him, but he didn't answer. The lights moved deeper, each sway disappearing behind branches until I couldn't see them at all. I waited 5 minutes, maybe more. The quiet pressed in like a hand over my ears. I told myself I'd give it another minute, then go in after him, but before I could, I saw something between the trees. 3 faint glows drifting back toward the road. My chest loosened in relief until I realized they weren't moving the same way. They weren't swaying now. They were gliding, slow and steady, and there was no one beneath them. I backed away, keeping my eyes on those lights as they floated to the edge of the road and stopped, hanging in the air like they were waiting. I didn't run then, I just kept walking backward until a bend in the road hid them from view. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I was knocking on the sheriff's door, trying to explain what I'd seen without sounding crazy. They sent a search party, dogs, men with radios, even a helicopter, but by sundown, there was nothing. No footprints, no scent trail, no sign Aaron had been there at all. The only thing they found was at the edge of the trees where I'd stopped. 3 soot-black poles driven deep into the ground. The kind you'd hang lanterns on, but without lanterns, without hooks even. Just smooth wood charred like it had been in a fire. The sheriff told me I was tired, maybe saw hunters in the dark and spooked myself. Folks around here don't like talking about strange things, but sometimes, on nights when the air gets heavy and the crickets fall silent, I drive out to that curve on Pine Hollow Road. I park with my lights off and wait. And every so often, through the trees, I see that slow, perfect sway. I never stay long enough to see if they notice me. Story 2. The Silent Circle in Dry Creek. It was the first frost of November when I decided to take my rifle out past Dry Creek. The air had that brittle edge that makes sound carry too far, and the forest floor was a patchwork of frozen leaves and mud, dark as coffee. I'd been tracking a buck since sunrise. Big animal, deep hoof prints leading me farther from the road than I usually cared to go. There weren't many places out there where folks wandered anymore. Too far from town, too easy to get turned around. But I knew the old logging trails and figured I could cut across one to head back before dark. That's when I found them. 7 people, standing in a perfect ring in a clearing I swear I'd never seen before. Their hands were clasped tight, each one linked to the next, heads tilted just slightly down, eyes closed. The ground beneath them was bare of leaves, just damp earth so dark it looked wet. The smell hit me first, like wet stone mixed with something metallic, sharp enough to sting my nose. My first thought was that I'd stumbled onto some kind of church group, or maybe folks holding a vigil, but there wasn't a candle or Bible in sight. I called out, my voice low, not wanting to spook them. No one moved. They didn't sway like people do when they stand too long, didn't shift their weight, didn't even seem to breathe. It was like they were carved from the ground itself. I took a step closer, my boots sinking slightly into the cold mud. Still nothing. The forest felt wrong, quiet, but not in the peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that feels like it's listening back. That's when I noticed their clothes. They weren't dressed for the cold. Thin shirts, faded overalls, skirts torn at the hem, no coats, no gloves, and yet none of them shivered. Their skin looked pale, but not the kind of pale you get from being indoors too long. It was flat, almost colorless, as if whatever blood ran beneath it had gone still. I felt my chest tighten. Every instinct I had was telling me to leave, so I took a slow step back. My heel found a dry stick in the leaves, and it snapped louder than it should have in the cold air. 7 pairs of eyes opened at the exact same moment. They were milky white. Not clouded like a blind man's, but blank, as if there was nothing inside to look out from. Every head turned toward me in perfect unison, and for a second, I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. I stumbled backward, keeping my eyes on them, waiting for one to step forward, to speak, to something. But they didn't move. Not one muscle, just stood there, watching me, their hands still clasped, their heads tracking me as I backed toward the trees. By the time I'd put a good 20 yards between us, I turned and ran. My boots tore at the ground, lungs burning in the cold, but when I glanced back over my shoulder, they were still in that same ring. Only their heads had shifted, all 7 turned just enough to keep me in their sight. I didn't stop until I could hear the creak again, the faint trickle over rocks breaking that awful silence. I told myself I was just spooked, that maybe I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to see, some backwoods ritual or an old family's way of honoring their dead. I didn't tell anyone when I got home. Folks in these parts don't take kindly to outsiders asking too many questions, and even though I was born here, I knew better than to poke at certain shadows. But 2 nights later, I woke to a sound outside my bedroom window. It was faint, like boots shifting on wet soil. I lay there listening, holding my breath. Then I realized it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing, slow, steady, and too close. I didn't move until morning. When I finally worked up the nerve to look outside, there was nothing there. No footprints in the frost, no sign of anything at all. Still, I didn't go back to Dry Creek, not until this past spring. I was out there with a friend, fishing where the creek runs shallow near the old mill site. The day was warm, the kind where you can almost forget the cold months ever existed. But as the sun dipped behind the ridge, the light shifted, and I glanced across the water. There, just beyond the tree line, 7 figures stood in a ring. Their hands were clasped, their heads were bowed, and even from that distance, I could tell their eyes were closed. I dropped my rod. My friend asked what was wrong, but when I looked again, the clearing was empty. I haven't been back since, but sometimes, late at night, I swear I can smell that same mix of damp earth and rust drifting in through my open window. And when it comes, the crickets stop, the world goes quiet, and I know, wherever they are, they're standing in a circle, waiting for me to come closer. Story 3. The Funeral That Never Ended. I'd heard the story from my uncle a dozen times growing up, usually told over a late-night fire when the air was cold enough to make the sparks look like tiny stars drifting into the dark. He'd lean back in his chair and start with, "Past Mason Ridge, there's a town that don't breathe anymore." And then he'd tell me about the flood back in '43 that swallowed the place whole. He said it had been a mining town, 30 families, a church, a general store, and not much else. Spring storms had hit hard that year, swollen the creek until it burst over its banks, and a wall of water came tearing down the mountain like the earth itself was shaking the town loose. No one rebuilt. Folks claimed the mud was too unstable, but my uncle always said it wasn't the ground that kept people away. It was what stayed behind. I never believed him. The way he told it, the old cemetery sat half sunk in muck, the church leaning to one side, its bell tower collapsed into the floodplain. He'd claim you could still hear the hymns some nights, drifting up through the pines like the congregation had never stopped singing. I figured it was just another Appalachian ghost story meant to keep kids from wandering too far. It wasn't until years later, on a late fall hike, that I found myself on a trail I didn't recognize. The leaves had turned brittle and brown, and the forest felt hollow in that way it does when winter's only a week or 2 away. The air smelled of wet soil and old bark, and each step made a sound that felt too loud. I'd been following a deer trail without much thought when I realized I'd lost the main path. I wasn't worried at first, I knew the ridges well enough, but then I started seeing things that didn't belong. The first was a stone marker, half buried and cracked down the middle. The inscription was worn smooth by decades of rain, but the cross carved into the top was still visible. A few yards later, another headstone leaned at a sharp angle, its base swallowed in black mud. And then, between the thinning trees, I saw it, the remains of the church. The building looked as if it had been dropped there centuries ago and forgotten. The walls were warped, the wood so weathered it had turned the color of ash. The steeple was gone, leaving only a jagged edge where it had once met the sky. Through the open doorway, I could see pews rotting in place, their ends eaten away by water and time. The air was colder here, heavy in my lungs, and the forest quiet felt deliberate. I don't know why I went inside. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe some part of me wanted to prove my uncle wrong. The floor was soft under my boots, a mix of dirt and splintered boards. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the walls, catching on motes of dust that drifted like slow snowflakes. I walked the center aisle until I reached the altar, then turned and looked back toward the door. That's when I saw it through the broken frame, a coffin halfway sunk into the mud just beyond the churchyard. The wood was dark, swollen from years of damp, and the lid sat slightly askew, as if it had been pried open and left. I stepped toward it without meaning to, my feet moving of their own accord. That was when I heard the singing. It started faint, so faint I thought it might be the wind catching somewhere in the hills. Low voices, drawn out notes like a hymn sung at half speed, each one bleeding into the next. I froze, listening. The words weren't clear, but the tone was mournful, rising and falling with a kind of slow inevitability. My pulse kicked hard in my throat. I told myself it was just some hunters or campers messing around, but as the singing grew louder, I realized it wasn't coming from a distance. It was circling me. I ducked behind a headstone, my breath shallow, and peered toward the sound. That's when I saw them. A group of people dressed head to toe in black, the kind of black that doesn't fade, even in shadow. Each held a candle, the flames unmoving despite the cool breeze that whispered through the clearing. They walked in a slow, deliberate circle around the coffin, their heads bowed just enough to hide their faces. The singing came from all of them, their voices blending into a single low drone that seemed to pull the air tighter around me. I don't know how long I crouched there, watching. Time felt wrong in that moment, stretched thin. The circle moved without pause, each step perfectly measured, and the hymn never broke, not once. Then one of them stepped forward and leaned over the coffin. The others didn't stop singing, didn't even glance up. I expected the figure to place a hand on the wood, maybe pray, but instead they bent low, as if whispering into the open space inside. I didn't mean to get closer, but the sound of their voice, or maybe the lack of it, pulled me forward. I inched along the side of the church until I was close enough to see the pale curve of something inside the coffin. Skin, a face. The whispering figure stayed bent for a long moment. And I realized the hymn had shifted slightly, the pitch changing in a way that made my stomach turn. Then it happened. The corpse, because that's what it was, no mistaking it, moved, not much, just enough for the lips to part. And then, in a voice no louder than the leaves moving overhead, it whispered back. I felt my knees weaken. The air seemed to thicken around me, and for a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. The one who'd leaned down, straightened, and stepped back into the circle without a word, and the singing continued as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't watch anymore. My body took over, turning me away, driving me back through the gravestones and into the trees. I didn't run, not yet. I walked fast, too aware of the crunch of leaves under my boots, too afraid to make a sound loud enough to carry. When I was sure the singing had faded, I broke into a run, branches clawing at my jacket as I barreled through the underbrush. I didn't stop until the forest began to thin and I saw the glint of the main road ahead. I never told my uncle I'd found the town. I never told anyone what I saw. People around here don't ask questions about things that sit too far back in the hollow, and I knew better than to go looking for trouble a second time. But trouble has a way of finding you. It's been 4 years since that day. I've moved twice, each time farther from the ridge. But sometimes at night, when the wind is still and the dark feels heavy, I hear it. That same slow hymn, the notes dragging like the voices are coming up through water. It starts soft, barely more than a hum, but once I notice it, I can't not hear it. I'll lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, and swear I catch the glow of candlelight flickering against the walls. I tell myself it's just memory, just my mind replaying something it doesn't understand. But there's a part of me, deep down, that knows the truth. The funeral never ended, and maybe it never will. Story 4. The Woman at the Black Altar. Folks in town always said not to wander past Beartooth Creek after sundown. Some said it was because of bears, others whispered about old mining shafts hidden in the hills, ready to swallow you whole. But when I was 22, I didn't care much for warnings. I'd grown up in those mountains, hunting, fishing, hiking every ridge and hollow I could find. I figured I knew the land better than anyone. That night, the air had a sharp bite, and the moon hung low over the trees, casting silver light on the creek. I'd been walking along the bank, letting the sound of rushing water carry me deeper into the woods than I'd meant to go. By By the time I realized the sun had dropped, the water looked black, and the forest had gone quiet in that unnatural way that makes your skin prickle. I should have turned back then. I crossed the creek at a shallow bend, my boots sinking into the mud, and climbed the opposite bank. The trees thinned ahead, and I saw an opening in the woods, lit only by moonlight. I don't know what made me keep going. Maybe curiosity, maybe the strange pull of finding something you didn't expect. But I stepped into that clearing like I'd been led there. In the center stood a black stone altar, waist high, its surface slick like it had been polished. The moonlight didn't bounce off it. It seemed to sink into the stone, swallowed whole. The ground around it was bare, not a single leaf or blade of grass. Just cold dirt that looked darker than the forest floor should. A woman was kneeling in front of it. She wore a white dress that hung loose on her frame, the fabric whispering in the breeze. Her hands rested flat on the stone, fingers spread wide, and her head was tilted like she was listening to something far away, something under the earth. Her hair was long and dark, spilling over her shoulders and almost touching the altar's surface. I opened my mouth to call out, but before I could make a sound, a voice filled my head. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, like someone whispering just behind my ear. It was her voice, though her lips never moved. She told me to kneel. My body reacted before my mind could argue. My knees buckled, and I dropped onto the cold dirt, my palms pressing into the ground. The earth felt wrong, solid one moment, then almost soft, like it was breathing. A slow, steady pulse moved through it, the same rhythm you feel when you press your ear to someone's chest and listen to their heart. The sound filled me, settling deep in my bones. The woman's voice came, again, telling me to listen. I didn't know what I was listening for, but I strained to hear beyond the pounding of my own pulse. There was something beneath us, faint but real, a low, steady hum, like wind moving through a hollow space, but thicker, heavier. I could feel it in my teeth, in the back of my skull. It made me dizzy, but I couldn't pull away. My eyes drifted shut without my permission, and images began to form, roots curling deep into darkness, water seeping through stone, and something vast lying just beneath the surface, shifting slowly in its sleep. When I opened my eyes again, the woman was standing. She hadn't made a sound getting to her feet. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me at all. She turned toward the tree line and began walking, her white dress brushing against her legs. Her bare feet made no sound on the dirt. I wanted to call out, to ask her what any of this meant, but the voice in my head returned, softer now, telling me not to follow. I stayed on my knees, watching her disappear into the shadows. Even when she was gone, I could still hear her, those same words looping over and over in my head until they blurred into something like a song. My legs felt heavy when I finally stood. The pulse in the ground had faded, but it left a strange emptiness behind, like I'd been holding something in my hands and someone had taken it away. The walk back to the creek felt longer than it should have. The woods pressed close, the air colder than before, and every step sounded too loud. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing there. When I reached the creek, the water was silent. Not quiet, silent. No splash of current over rocks, no gurgle at the bends. I crossed as quickly as I could and didn't stop moving until I saw the faint glow of my cabin through the trees. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the altar, the pale curve of her hands against the black stone, the way the earth had pulsed beneath me, and always, her voice, steady, patient, never raising or lowering, just repeating the same words, telling me to listen. Days passed, but it didn't fade. I'd be chopping wood or mending a fence, and I'd catch myself staring off toward the ridge where Beartooth Creek ran, my ears straining for that hum beneath the ground. Sometimes I'd think I heard it, a faint throb under the normal sounds of the mountain, and my hands would go still, my breath catching. I started dreaming about her. In the dreams, she wasn't always kneeling. Sometimes she was standing in the clearing, her hands raised to the sky, or walking along the creek with her feet just above the water. Once, I dreamt I was the one at the altar, my palms pressed to the stone, and I woke with dirt under my nails. I stopped going into town much. People noticed, asked if I was feeling all right, but I didn't know how to explain it. I couldn't tell them that I heard someone's voice in my head at all hours, that I felt tied to a place I'd been told my whole life to avoid. About a month after that night, I finally gave in and went back. It was late, the moon full and high, the same cold light spilling over the ridge. I followed the creek without hesitation this time, crossed at the same shallow bend, and stepped into the clearing. The altar was there, exactly as before, the dirt around it bare and dark, but she wasn't there. I knelt anyway. My hands found the stone, and the pulse came instantly, strong and sure. The hum rose beneath me, threading into my bones. I closed my eyes and listened. Somewhere deep below, that vast shape moved again, and this time I felt certain it knew I was there. The voice returned, not a whisper now, but something fuller. And I understood, it wasn't just her voice. It was something older, speaking through her, speaking through the earth itself. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was empty. The hum faded, but the rhythm stayed in my chest, beating alongside my own heart. I left without looking back, but I knew I'd return. I still hear her every night, her voice weaving into my thoughts until I can't tell where mine end and hers begin. And when the ground under my cabin trembles, just barely enough to notice, I wonder if that thing beneath the earth has finally started to wake. Story 5. The Gathering at Old Salt Mine. Number 7. They always told us not to mess around near Old Salt Mine Number 7. The place had been boarded up long before I was born. After an accident that killed half a dozen men, my grandfather said the company sealed it for safety, but folks in town told different stories, about voices that carried up from the shaft at night, about the taste of metal in the air, about people who went in and didn't come back. I never thought much of it. I'd passed it plenty of times while hunting, just another rotting scar in the hillside with its entrance covered in warped timbers, rusted nails jutting out like teeth. But there were nights, cold, clear ones in late fall, when you could stand far off and see a faint flicker of light slipping through the gaps in the wood. Most folks pretended they didn't notice. It was one of those nights when I got the idea to take a closer look. I'd been out checking traps and was cutting back across the ridge when I saw it. Soft orange light spilling in thin lines between the boards. It was too steady to be a reflection, too warm to be a flashlight. My breath clouded in front of me as I crept closer, the frost on the grass crunching under my boots. The closer I got, the more I realized the air smelled strange. Not the damp earth I expected, but something sharp, like minerals scraped fresh from stone. I found a spot between the boards where the wood had warped enough to leave a finger-wide gap. Pressing my face to it, I peered inside. The mine tunnel stretched back farther than my eyes could follow, the walls glistening faintly as if slick. Down the center, a line of people was moving slowly toward the shaft. They wore clothes that looked older than me, wool coats gone thin, skirts torn and trailing in the dirt, boots caked in mud. None of them spoke. Each held a small mound of something white in their hands, cradled carefully as though it might spill. It took me a second to realize it was salt. When the first in line reached the mouth of the shaft, they knelt and poured their salt in a rough circle on the ground, their hands trembling slightly. Then they lowered themselves until their faces touched, the dirt inside the ring. I could see their shoulders rise and fall in slow, measured breaths, as if they were breathing something in. One by one, the others followed, each repeating the same ritual, pouring, kneeling, pressing their faces into the ground. The only sound was the faint grit of salt falling, the shuffle of boots on stone. My heart was hammering, but I couldn't pull myself away. I watched the 10th person in line, a tall man with a shaved head and a frame like he'd been built for heavy work. He moved with a strange kind of calm, his steps deliberate, his gaze fixed on the shaft. When he reached the circle, he poured his salt, knelt, and lowered his face. For a moment, nothing. Then he lifted his head and his eyes swept the tunnel until they locked on mine. Even from that distance, I felt it. A cold recognition, like he'd been expecting me. Slowly, deliberately, he smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile you give to reassure someone. It was stretched too far, too steady, and it didn't touch his eyes. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but somehow I knew they were meant for me. Whatever he said, the others heard it too. Without hesitation, every head lifted from the dirt and turned toward me. Dozens of faces pale in the candlelight, their eyes dull and unblinking. The sound started then, feet pounding against the packed earth of the tunnel. It wasn't a sprint, but a steady, relentless advance, the kind you couldn't outrun if they didn't want you to. I stumbled back from the boards, my shoulder catching on a rusted nail. Pain flared, but I didn't stop. I turned and ran, the sound of their approach spilling out of the tunnel behind me. My boots tore at the frost-hardened ground, breath burning in my chest. The pounding grew louder, closer, and I didn't dare look back. The ridge dipped, and I cut down through a thicket, branches whipping at my face. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw nothing. The mine entrance was sealed tight, the boards as still and weathered as they'd always been. No light, no movement, no sign anyone had been there at all. I didn't stop running until I reached the dirt road that led back to my truck. My hands shook as I dug out my keys, every shadow along the roadside feeling too deep, too occupied. By the time I made it home, I'd convinced myself it had to be some kind of trick of the light, or maybe I'd stumbled into someone's idea of a prank. Still, I didn't go back to the ridge for weeks. When I finally did, it was daylight. The mine sat there, silent, its boards grey and splintered, the ground around it undisturbed. I told myself it had been my imagination, but that night, lying in bed, I heard it, faint at first, then clearer. The measured pound of dozens of feet on hard-packed earth somewhere deep beneath me. I don't go near the mine anymore. But I've started to notice other things. Sometimes, in the dead hours before dawn, I'll wake to find a thin dusting of salt across my porch. And twice now, when I've gone out to check my traps, I've found small circles of it pressed into the dirt, the center smoothed flat, as if someone had been there, breathing in the ground. I don't know if they followed me from that night, or if I was always meant to find them. All I know is that if you ever see light flicker behind those boards, turn around, don't look, and whatever you do, don't let them catch you watching. Story 6. The Chapel in the Pines. I'd been walking since early that morning, certain I could cut across the ridge and hit the old fire road before sundown. I'd hunted these woods plenty of times, but I'd gone deeper than I meant to, chasing a buck's tracks, and somewhere along the way, the landmarks I knew had slipped away. The afternoon sky had turned a dull, cold grey, and the temperature dropped with it. The wind had gone still, and every step I took through the pines seemed to echo in my ears. By the time I admitted to myself I was lost, the light was fading fast, and the woods around me had taken on that strange, colourless look they get just before dark. I figured I'd find a dry patch of ground, build a fire, and wait for daylight. But then I saw it through the trees, a sliver of straight lines and angles where there shouldn't have been any. It was a tiny building, almost swallowed by the pines around it. The wood was grey with age, the boards warped and splitting. There were no windows, just a crooked door leaning on rusted hinges. A thin seam of light leaked out from the bottom, not bright like electricity, but a dim, flickering glow. My first thought was that it might be an old hunting shack, maybe a place to get warm for a minute. My boots crunched over pine needles as I stepped closer, and the smell hit me, musty, like wet cloth left in a basement too long, mixed with something faintly sweet and metallic. I hesitated at the threshold, my hand hovering over the door. From inside came a low, steady sound, almost like a hum, layered with voices speaking in unison. I couldn't make out the words, but the rhythm of it pulled at me, as though stepping inside was the most natural thing I could do. I pushed the door, and it gave way with a groan. The air inside was so thick it felt like breathing through a damp rag. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dim candlelight, the flames wavering in shallow pools of wax scattered across a table in the center of the room. Around the table stood 7 people, their backs to me, their heads bowed. The table itself was covered in glass jars of different sizes, each filled to the brim with what I thought at first were small stones. But as I stepped closer, the shapes resolved into something unmistakable. Teeth. Human teeth. Hundreds of them, some yellowed with age, some still with bits of root attached. The chanting rolled on, low and slow, in a language I'd never heard before. It was neither angry nor joyful, but somewhere in between, heavy and deliberate. My instinct told me to back away quietly, to slip out the way I'd come, but before I could, one of the figures moved. A woman in a faded blue dress reached into a jar and lifted out a single tooth. She held it aloft between 2 fingers, turning it in the candlelight like it was a diamond. The others stopped chanting. The silence was immediate and complete. One by one they turned toward me. Their faces were pale. Eyes sunk deep in shadow. No one spoke. No one blinked. The air seemed to tighten in my chest. I tried to back up, but before I could take a full step, the door behind me slammed shut with a force that rattled the boards. The sound echoed in the tiny room, and in that echo the chanting started again. Only this time, it was faster, sharper, like it had been waiting for me. The woman with the tooth stepped forward, her eyes fixed on mine. She held it out toward me, her hand trembling just slightly, and I could see now that the enamel was cracked, stained a dark reddish brown. She murmured something under her breath, and though I couldn't understand the words, the meaning pressed hard against my mind, like she was asking me to take it. I shook my head, but my feet wouldn't move. The others began circling the table, their voices rising in pitch, the rhythm closing in around me. I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, and my vision swam as though the candlelight had grown too bright. My hand lifted without my permission, and for a moment I thought I might actually take the tooth from her. But before my fingers touched it, the chanting stopped again, cut off mid-breath. Every head tilted just slightly, like they were all listening to something I couldn't hear. The woman lowered the tooth, her expression unreadable. Then, in perfect unison, they stepped back from the table, leaving the jars and the candles as they were. One of the men reached out and blew out the nearest flame, and the darkness spread like water, snuffing out one light after another until the room was nearly black. The only glow came from the seam beneath the door, but when I turned to it, it was gone. No light, no way out. I pressed my hands to the wall, searching for the doorframe, but the wood under my fingers felt different now, warmer, almost pulsing faintly, like something alive. My breath quickened, and in the dark the chanting returned, softer this time, just a whisper brushing my ears. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It felt like it was inside my head. When the first hand touched my shoulder, I spun, but there was nothing there, only the sound of bare feet shifting on the warped floorboards. The whispering grew louder, overlapping itself, too many voices to separate. My heartbeat matched their rhythm, faster and faster until I thought my chest might burst. Then, just as suddenly, it all stopped. The candles flared to life again. I was standing alone in the chapel, the table empty, the jars gone. The air was clear, no heavier than any other room. The door was just behind me, hanging crooked as before. I stumbled out into the night, the cold air hitting me so hard it made my eyes water. The forest was silent, the trees swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel on my skin. I don't remember the walk back. I must have found my way by instinct, because the next thing I knew, I was standing on the dirt road a mile from my truck. My hands were numb, and when I looked down, my palms were streaked with something white and gritty. I brushed at it, but it clung to my skin, caught under my nails. It was only later, under the light of my kitchen lamp, that I realized it was enamel dust. I never found that chapel again. I've gone back, retraced my steps, but the forest shifts somehow, like it's hiding it from me. And yet, sometimes when I wake in the dark, I swear I can smell that same damp air, feel the weight of it in my lungs. Once or twice, I've found something small on my nightstand, a single tooth, old and yellowed, lying there like it's been waiting for me to pick it up. Story 7. The Bonfire on Devil's Run. It was just past midnight when I turned off County Road 17 onto Devil's Run, a narrow 2-lane stretch that wound through the hills like it was trying to lose itself. I'd driven it 100 times before, always late, always alone, and I'd never once passed another car. The trees pressed in on both sides, their bare branches knitting together above the road like skeletal fingers. My headlights caught the frost on the asphalt, and I kept one hand on the wheel, the other wrapped around the lukewarm coffee in my thermos. I was maybe 5 miles from the turnoff to my place when I saw it, light flickering against the tree line, orange and alive, nothing like the pale sweep of my headlights. At first I thought it might be a brush fire, but the glow was too steady, too deliberate. It was big, bigger than any campfire had a right to be. I slowed without meaning to, my eyes drawn to the source. Through a gap in the trees, I caught the shape of flames licking upward, throwing shadows that moved in strange, unnatural ways. I pulled onto the narrow shoulder, the gravel popping under my tires, and killed the engine. For a moment, I sat there, listening to the ticking of the cooling motor and the hush of the forest. The flames were still there, steady and tall, maybe 50 yards from the road. I told myself I'd just take a look. Maybe it was some teenagers doing something stupid. But there was a weight in my chest that told me I already knew it wasn't that. The embankment was steeper than it looked, my boots sliding on loose dirt as I picked my way down. The air was sharp with cold, but the closer I got, the more I could feel the heat of the fire. I crouched low when I reached the tree line, staying in the shadows. The clearing opened up before me, lit in violent shades of orange and red. A dozen figures stood in a wide circle around the fire. They were dressed in dark hoods and heavy coats, their faces completely hidden. Each one held a thick rope in both hands, and all the ropes stretched toward the center of the flames. My eyes followed them, my mind trying to understand what I was seeing. It was a wooden cross, rough-hewn and blackened at the base from the heat. Someone was tied to it, their head hanging low, their arms lashed out along the crossbeam. The fire roared around them close enough that I could see the heat rippling the air, but somehow the flames didn't seem to touch the wood itself. My stomach twisted. I opened my mouth to call out, to do something, but before I could, the figure on the cross raised their head. Even from where I stood, I could see their eyes, wide, desperate, locked on mine like they'd been waiting for me. Their mouth moved fast, forming words I couldn't hear over the crackle of the fire, but the urgency in their expression was unmistakable. I froze, caught between the pull to run forward and the instinct to get as far away as possible. Then the hooded figures turned. Every one of them. Their heads swiveled in perfect unison, and the fire seemed to flare brighter, hotter, casting their shadows tall against the trees. Though I couldn't see their faces, I felt their attention settle on me like a hand pressing against my chest. I stumbled back, my boot snapping a twig loud enough to break the moment into something worse. The sound echoed and the air shifted, the kind of shift you feel in the woods before something starts moving toward you. I turned and ran, not caring about the noise now, branches whipping my arms and face. Behind me, the fire roared higher, and for a split second, I thought I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, pacing me through the trees. When I reached the embankment, I scrambled up on hands and knees, the cold dirt giving way under my palms. I half slid, half crawled over the edge, and didn't stop until I was in the driver's seat, my breath ragged. I fumbled the keys, dropping them once before jamming them into the ignition. The engine coughed to life, and I slammed the car into gear. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Through the trees, I caught a final glimpse of the clearing. The cross was gone. So were the ropes, the figure, the hooded people. Only the fire remained, a low, steady burn that didn't throw any smoke into the night sky. I drove the rest of the way home without the radio, without the coffee, my hands locked tight on the wheel. My headlights caught nothing but the road, and I kept expecting to see a dark shape step out from the shoulder. But the road stayed empty, and by the time I turned onto my gravel driveway, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the person's mouth moving, trying to tell me something. I woke before dawn, my throat dry, my chest tight. I went outside for air and found the frost on my porch had been disturbed, melted in the shape of a rough cross, the wood beneath it still faintly warm to the touch. I don't drive Devil's Run anymore. I take the long way, even if it adds half an hour. But sometimes, on cold, clear nights, I think I can still see a flicker out there on the horizon. And every time I do, I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed to hear what they were trying so hard to say. Story 8. The Children of Stillwater Creek. It was the first warm morning after a week of steady rain, the kind that makes the air smell like wet bark and turns the dirt roads into slick ribbons of mud. I'd been up since before the sun, gear already packed, thermos full, and the idea fixed in my head that I'd spend the better part of the day on Stillwater Creek. That stretch of water had always been good to me, slow moving, clear enough to see the trout darting under the shallows, and far enough out of the way that you could go hours without hearing another human voice. It was the kind of place that felt unchanged no matter how many years passed. When I got there, the mist was still hanging low over the water, curling around the branches that bent over the banks. I picked my usual spot, a gravel bar where the creek widened just enough for a decent cast, and settled in. The only sounds were the quiet rush of the current and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when I heard it, giggling. It was light and quick, the kind of sound you'd expect from kids playing tag, but there was something about it that didn't sit right. It wasn't coming from the trail behind me, but from downriver, just out of sight around a bend. I figured maybe a family from town had decided to make a morning of it, though it was early for anyone else to be out here. Curiosity got the better of me, and I reeled in, setting my rod down on the rocks. The giggling grew louder as I walked, but there was no splashing, no sound of footsteps in the water, just that strange, steady laughter. When I stepped out from behind the bend, I stopped cold. 5 children stood knee-deep in the creek. They were barefoot, their feet pale against the dark stones beneath the water. Each one held something small and limp by the tail or the wings. 2 had rabbits, 1 had a bird, and the others had what looked like field mice. Their clothes hung loose and colorless, the kind you couldn't buy in a store anymore, and their skin was so pale it almost reflected the water's surface. They didn't notice me at first. They were dipping the animals into the creek, holding them under with slow, deliberate movements. The giggling came again, but it was wrong. No rises or falls in the sound, no breaks for breath. It was like they were all laughing in perfect unison, though none of their mouths moved. I must have made a sound because the next moment they all looked up at me, not one at a time, not startled, just all at once. Their eyes were wide and dark, unblinking in the morning light, and the laughter stopped like someone had cut a wire. The air felt heavier then, colder somehow, though the sun had just started breaking through the trees. None of them spoke, but they didn't have to. The way they stared made it clear they were waiting for me to step closer, to stand among them in that still, cold water. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away, slow and careful, my boots slipping slightly on the wet stones. For a moment, none of them moved, and I thought maybe I'd be able to slip out of sight without another sound. Then one of the girls, the smallest of the group, smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was too tight, too steady, and it didn't touch her eyes. She opened her mouth and shaped a word I couldn't hear. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and walked as quickly as I dared until I was around the bend. Then I ran, my breath loud in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the gravel bar where I'd left my gear. The creek behind me was silent, but I could feel their eyes on my back the whole way out of the woods. That night, I couldn't get the image out of my head. The pale feet in the dark water, the limp weight of the animals, the perfect unison of their movements. I lay awake for hours, listening to the rain start up again, telling myself I'd imagined the way they'd all looked at me like I'd already made some kind of promise. The next morning, I went back. I told myself it was just to fish, just to prove to myself that the creek was the same as it had always been. When I got there, the smell hit me before I even reached the water. The surface was covered in fish, dozens of them, floating belly up, their scales catching the weak sunlight. The current pushed them gently along the banks, their mouths open as if they'd been caught mid-breath. I stood there a long time, the sound of the water suddenly too loud, and I realized the woods around me was silent again. No birdsong, no wind through the branches, not even the low hum of insects. Just the slow drift of the dead towards somewhere I couldn't see. I haven't been back to Stillwater Creek since, but sometimes, on quiet mornings when the fog settles in low, I think I can hear that same giggling, faint and far away, and I wonder if they're still there, waiting for me to join them. Story 9. The House with No Doors. I'd been tracking a buck since early morning, moving deeper into the mountains than I usually went. The sky was overcast, the air damp and cold enough to carry the smell of wet pine down the slopes. The buck's prints had led me off any path I recognized, over rocky ground and through underbrush that tore at my jacket. I wasn't worried about being lost, not yet. The ridges here curved in familiar ways, and I could always follow the stream down to the valley. It was around midday when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, just a pale, square shape between the trees where there shouldn't have been anything man-made. As I got closer, the shape sharpened into straight boards. Fresh and light-colored, like they'd been cut and nailed together within the last month. It was a cabin, about the size of a one-room shack, the kind hunters sometimes throw together for shelter. The wood was clean, the roof still smelled faintly of tar, and there wasn't a single mark of weathering on it. But there was something wrong. There were no windows, no door, just solid walls, unbroken from corner to corner. I walked a slow circle around it, boots sinking in the soft ground. Each side was the same, bare boards fitted tight, no seams except where they'd been joined. The corners were sharp, the nails driven flush, the kind of work someone takes their time on. It didn't look abandoned, it looked sealed. That's when I heard it. A low murmur, like a crowd speaking just below the edge of hearing. I stopped moving, held my breath, and listened. It wasn't coming from the trees or the hills. It was coming from inside the cabin. Dozens of voices, all speaking in the same slow rhythm, rising and falling together. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was steady, almost like a song with no melody. I stepped closer until I could feel the dampness of the wood under my palm. Pressing my ear against it, I realized the sound was clearer here, not loud but deep, like it was coming from far below the surface. The voices moved together in strange harmony, overlapping just enough to make my chest tighten. The longer I listened, the more I noticed something else. The wall was warm, not just from the touch of sunlight. It was fever warm, like skin. I pulled my hand back and stared at the boards, half expecting them to be breathing. Then the voices stopped. The silence was sudden, heavy. I stayed frozen where I was, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. And then, from directly in front of me, there came 3 slow knocks. Not the sharp rap of knuckles on wood. These were dull, weighty, like something pressing from the other side. I took a step back, but before I could turn away, I heard it, a whisper, so close it should have been right against my ear, though there was no one beside me. "Let us out." The words slid into my head more than they reached my ears. I turned fast, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no tracks in the soft soil except mine. The cabin stood still and perfect, the pale wood unmarked, the forest hushed around it. I wanted to leave right then, but my legs didn't move. Some part of me needed to be sure. I stepped around to the other side, half hoping I'd find a hidden hatch or door, anything to explain it. But every wall was the same, sealed and smooth, the boards tight together like they'd grown that way. The air felt thicker the longer I stayed, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. I thought I heard faint scratching beneath my boots, not from the ground, but from somewhere under it. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the cabin until the trees closed it off from view. The hike back down took longer than it should have. The woods seemed different, quieter, yes, but also watchful. I kept expecting to hear the murmur again, drifting through the branches, but there was nothing until I reached the stream. That night, I lay awake, listening for any sound beyond my walls. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. 3 slow knocks, so faint they could have been my own heartbeat. Then, a whisper, low and certain. "Let us out." I've been back to that ridge twice since then. Both times in daylight, both times without finding it. The forest looks the same, the ground undisturbed. But sometimes when I'm hunting and the wind goes still, I catch the smell of fresh-cut wood and tar, and in the distance, just for a moment, I hear them, dozens of voices in low, perfect harmony, waiting. Story 10. The Procession on Midnight Ridge. I'd been making the climb up Midnight Ridge since I was a teenager, but that night was the first time I'd ever stayed to camp at the summit. It wasn't the most forgiving place. Wind tore at you from both sides, and the ground was nothing but stone and patches of wiry grass. But the view was worth it. From up there, you could see the valley stretch out in all directions, the dark outline of the mountains rolling away like waves. I'd made a small fire, cooked what I'd brought, and settled in under the kind of quiet you only get that high up. It must have been close to midnight when I saw them. At first it was just a faint orange flicker along the ridge's far edge, barely noticeable against the dark. I thought it might be lightning flashing behind the clouds, but the glow stayed, and after a few moments, shapes began to form in it. Figures, tall, thin, and moving in single file, walking along the horizon. Each carried a torch, the flames swaying in unison as if the wind couldn't touch them. Their pace was slow, deliberate, and perfectly matched, like they were tied together by an unseen rope. I sat there watching, counting them as they passed between the gaps in the rock. 1, 2, 3. By the time I reached 20, I realized they weren't just skirting the ridge. They were coming straight toward my camp. The flames grew brighter, their shapes clearer against the night. Something deep in my gut told me not to be seen. I kicked dirt over my fire until it hissed out, the smoke curling low and heavy. Then I lay back on my bedroll, pulling my coat up over me, forcing my breathing to slow. The night closed in around me, broken only by the steady crunch of footsteps on stone. They were getting closer. At first, the sound was distant, like the echo of someone walking in a tunnel. Then it swelled, filling the air so that I could feel each step through the ground. The rhythm was perfect, every footfall landing at the same moment, heavy enough to make the stones shift. My eyes stayed shut, but the glow of torchlight began to bleed through my eyelids, pulsing brighter with each second. I told myself not to look. If I didn't look, maybe they'd pass. But curiosity has a way of cutting through fear, and before I knew it, my eyes were open. They were all around me. The torches were held low, their flames casting light upward into the faces of those who held them, and every face was the same. Eyes closed tight, lids pressed so hard I could see the faint tremor of the muscles beneath. Mouths open wide in silent screams, their jaws stretched to the point of pain. The torchlight flickered over skin so pale it seemed almost translucent, veins threading faintly beneath the surface. None of them looked at me, at least not with their eyes, but the way they stood, their bodies angled slightly inward, made me feel like I was the center of something I didn't understand. I wanted to move, to sit up or run, but my limbs felt heavy, pinned by something unseen. The line of them stretched out into the dark beyond my camp, disappearing into the night in both directions. The ones closest to me stood so still that the flames of their torches didn't waver. I tried to speak, to ask what they wanted, but the moment I opened my mouth, the footsteps started again. They didn't turn or shift their torches. They simply began walking, still in perfect unison, continuing their procession down the slope. The light thinned as they moved away, until only the faint glow of the last torch remained, swaying gently before vanishing into the black. I lay there for a long time, my ears straining for any sound beyond the wind. When I was sure they were gone, I sat up and got my fire going again, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the matches. The warmth didn't help. I kept turning toward the path they'd taken, half expecting to see the light return. At dawn, I broke camp and headed down the ridge. The rocks where they'd walked were bare, no soot, no dropped embers, not even the scuff of a boot print. It was as if they'd never been there at all. I've never camped on Midnight Ridge again, but on certain nights, when the clouds are low and the valley is quiet, I'll see the faintest line of torchlight moving along the horizon, and every time, I wonder if they remember where I was lying, and if one night they'll decide not to keep walking.